How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another Pioneer tier list video. If you're enjoying my content, please be sure to like and subscribe. We had a lot of data this week with over 1100 deck lists from Magic Online, so if you'd like to see a full breakdown of the data, please check out my article over on thegathering.gg. Now, let's dive right into the tier list for this week. Once again, we have no decks in the S tier. The deeper we've gotten into the RCQ season, the more balance we're seeing in the format. There are some frontrunners for sure in the A tier, but nothing is detrimentally ahead of the rest of the field, and overall the metagame is pretty balanced and most decks can find success. Next up, we have the D tier. Starting out with Azorius Control, this deck drops from C tier previously. It had 4% of the overall metagame, 3% of the premier metagame, and 3% of the winners metagame, but only put up one top 8. We've started to see the deck struggle to put up consistent results, and while it's had a few good weeks here and there, I'm fairly confident to say that it is not a great choice right now, even if you do have a few matchups like into Amalia that are really good. Next up, we have Izzet and Sol. This deck also moves down a tier as it was only 3% of the overall metagame, 3% of the premier metagame, 3% of the winners metagame with 2 top 8s for the week. It is still one of the viable aggro decks of the format, but as we continue to see the format evolve, we are seeing it fall off compared to the slickshot show-off decks that seem to have a little bit more staying power. Next up, we have Dimir Control, which is new to the list this week, putting up 1% across the board with 2 top 8s. This deck is starting to find some success, in part thanks to Deadly Cover-Up, being able to exile key combo pieces from decks like Amalia or Phoenix, but also just a variety of good removal, good interaction, and quality spells. Next up, we have Humans, which stays in the D tier with 3% across the board and 1 top 8. Much like with Izzet and Sol, we're seeing a variety of aggro decks find viability, but Humans isn't putting up the consistent results to keep climbing up the tier list. Next up, we have Lotus Field Combo. This sits with 3% overall, 3% premier, 2% in the winners metagame, but had 0 top 8s this week. While Lotus Field is still one of the best decks you can play into the control metagame or into Phoenix, as well as possibly into vampires, the addition of the Sorin Ripper combo really speeds up their clock, making it tough to even have that be as good a matchup as it used to be against old Rakdos midrange, and the glut of aggro decks continues to give Lotus problems. Last up in the D tier, we have Spirits. This is a combination of Azorius Spirits and Mono Blue Spirits with 2% overall for Blue White Spirits, 1% overall for Mono Blue, 3% Premier for Blue White, 0% for Mono Blue, 1% in the winners metagame for Blue White, 0% in the winners metagame for Mono Blue, 2 top 8s for Blue White and 1 for Mono Blue. The big thing we're seeing is that the conversion rate keeps dropping, even though it did put up 3 total top 8s between the 2 decks. It keeps dropping from 3% overall, 3% Premier to 1% total winners metagame, and it seems like Spirits is not finding its place as the tempo deck of the format. Next up, we move to the C tier, which this week is mostly made up of some new decks to the tier list. We start off with a classic in Rakdos midrange. This deck has started to see a resurgence lately as people have been pivoting between whether or not they want to be the Vampire Shell or more traditional midrange, as the more traditional midrange deck seems to have a little bit more consistent game against the various aggro decks, as it's more focused on interaction and just viable good stuff spells. With 3% overall, 3% premier, 2% in the winners metagame, but 4 top 8s. This is a big showing for this deck for the week, and while I'm not sure if it will continue to rise or if it's going to stay around C tier, mostly it is splitting overall percentages, taking a lot of players I imagine that normally play vampires and just converting them back to Rakdos. I don't know if it has a lot of chance to keep moving up independently, but it does seem like Rakdos in its old form is back, even if it isn't quite as powerful as vampires. Next up, we have Mono Red Aggro, which remains in the C tier. This deck is another one of these slickshot show-off decks that is able to consistently run people over with 4% overall, 4% premier, and 5% in the winners metagame, along with 1 top 8. It's clearly a consistently strong deck, even if it isn't quite putting up the numbers of rule aggro. Last up, we have Insidious Roots. This deck has been taking off lately, and really, even though we saw it put up periodic finishes before, the big thing holding it back was its consistency in getting play. Now it has a 1% overall metagame share, 2% in the premier, 1% in the winners metagame, but put up 3 top top 8s, including a challenge win this week. I think the deck is very strong and will only get stronger as more people play with it, tweak the lists, and continue to become comfortable with it. I think this weekend will be the weekend where we start to see it gain enough traction to keep moving up the list, because the conversion rate has been way better than the amount of people playing it, and I'm excited to see more people pick it up and see if they can take it to good finishes. Next up, we have the B tier. We start off with Mono Black Discard, which moves down a tier from previous weeks, even though it still had a strong finish with 8% overall, 9% in the Premier metagame, and 8% in the Winners metagame, along with 6 top 8s. The deck seems to be struggling a little bit with finding its footing overall. Even though many players have found success with it, it's not quite able to keep generating those really strong weekends that some of the other A tier decks have done consistently over a longer period of time. While it is quality-wise probably an A tier deck, it does need to keep putting up consistent results that are in line with those other top decks to stay there. Next up, we have Gruul Aggro with 7% overall, 8% Premier, and 8% Winners metagame with 6 top 8s. That seems to be a pretty consistent line right now for the B tier, is around that 6 top 8 number. This is the best of the Slickshot show-off aggro decks and really seems to have solidified itself as the best aggro deck of the format right now. Last up, we have the A tier, which is feeling a little bit full this week with 4 decks up here. First up, we have a new addition to the A tier in Amalia combo. This deck had an outstanding weekend with 9% overall, 9% Premier, 12% in the Winners metagame, and 15 top 8s. That was over 20% of the overall challenge top 8s we had all week. The deck continues to impress, and as people pick it up more and more, even with the problems of the forced draws that can sometimes come up, including crashing Moto, we're still seeing players take this deck and do exceedingly well with it. It's performed very well into Phoenix as well as into a lot of the aggro decks with your life gain. I think it has a huge amount of resiliency against most other decks. And while you can struggle sometimes against control, there isn't a whole lot of it floating around, as both the top decks are in the D tier this week. So it's a really good choice, especially if you're looking to play your locals this weekend. Next up, we sort of have the consistent trio from this season, starting off with Izzet Phoenix with 12% overall, 12% Premier, and 13% of the Winners metagame, along with 12 top 8s. Phoenix continues its push as the second best deck pretty much every given week and is putting up monstrous results once again. Next up, we have Vampires, which put up 14% overall, 13% of the Premier metagame, and 15% of the Winners metagame, having the highest Winners metagame share, but with only 7 top 8s. It looks like even though the deck was putting up really consistent top level results, it wasn't quite converting this week, and given the amount of Amalia and Phoenix in the top 8s, it seems like the numbers were pushed around a little, so Vampires had a lot of strong finishes, but not quite a lot of top 8s. Last up, we have Niv, which continues to sit here in the A tier, but I will say is starting to look a little bit shaky as of this last weekend, with 8% overall, 8% of the Premier metagame, but the 10% of the Winners metagame is really carrying it here, since it too only had 6 top 8s. And there you have it. That's this week's Pioneer tier list. Thank you all for watching. Until next time.